Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 300th episode of the War Report. Now, unfortunately, just because of scheduling, we don't have anything too extravagant for today, so we're hoping in the next week or two to give you a big show proper of a show that's gotten to 300 episodes, but it's just going to be pretty standard as of today. We'll just call this 299 and a half just to cover on bases here. Okay, it's the unofficial 300th episode. The real 300th episode will come in another week or two. So just keep your eye out for that. It's going to be a fun time. Just all the the usual things. But there's been quite a bit of development, and we are a little pressed on time. So let's not waste any more time and get right into it.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of the reason I wanted to do this episode was the day after I was uncertain. Maybe we should do a midweek episode, and that's because the kind of breakthrough that was happening in Avdiivka and Ochertina, but also the other host of things that have been happening in the northern part of Ukraine. That TV tower that was taken out in Kharkov, and more of the thermal power stations that have been destroyed. Some, um, in the Lvov area have kind of recovered, or they weren't completely destroyed, and they have been destroyed. So my thought was, is Russia ready to do another open up a new offensive? And we were talking about, you know, generally speaking, it wasn't. I still don't believe it. The time is right. Part of that is the weather. Part of that is we don't know if they have enough. I mean, they probably have enough manpower, but you know, like trying to cut off a city like Kharkov, it's not an easy thing. But I just thought like maybe that is something
And then there's
that
quite a bit
they're
of
going.
a diplomatic intrigue just even outside the battlefield that we'll certainly
Yes,
get into that are very much informing the events of what's going on in Ukraine on both sides of this.
that's right. So why don't we start with the first map, which is a topographical map of the Avdiivka section, um, and then I'll follow with some blow-ups of the gains around Ochertine, or as the Russians, I guess, call it Ochertina, and in the surrounding regions. So as you can see, this is northwest of the city of Donetsk, and it's also northwest of of Avdiivka, which is right next to Donetsk city. So yeah, you can go. So you basically what you're looking at in the topographical map is the red areas obviously are the heights. So the Russians are going to move along the heights, and that direction that they're going eventually will lead to the town of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is a town in the Donetsk Oblast, part of the Donbass, and it is fairly far west, and but it's also kind of like a hub in that it has a lot of railways that link it with basically with everything that is involved with the Eastern Front that the Russians sorry that the Ukrainians are using to fight against the Russians, and that even includes it is a tactical hub basically for um, sending supplies even down to Ugledar in one form or another, right? So um, I'm just trying to see if I have I did outline. Okay, I'm just going to give you this slide. I know it wasn't part of the just to explain to people where Pokrovsk roughly is. I'm going to send you this slide right
Okay.
now, and you can post that. So that's where it is, and so this is kind of like a spoke, not a spoke, sorry, a hub, uh, from which all these different spokes, roads, and railways emerge from. It's on a height, and it's part of a ridge line that leads from Ochertine into it. And Siersky today even mentioned that the situation at the front is deteriorating, that they're going to have to pull out of certain areas. They already have. including the much fought over Berdici. The brigade that was there surrendered. The remnants of it. Neither the Ukrainians or the Russians have revealed how many soldiers surrendered. It's not going to be around 800 or so that surrendered in Avdiivka, but it won't be 5 or 6 either. So you know, so the general movement of the Russian forces in 2024 is about 60 square kilometers a month. The Russians, as of yesterday, have already reached just under 80 square kilometers. And there are still a few more days left, and they seem to be on a roll. Even Forbes and Bloomberg did some articles on what happened in Ochertina, and it's kind of like what I was talking about on the last show, and that is you had the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which has been heavily attritioned. They even spoke to one of its commanders who mentioned that 30% of the brigade was destroyed just in the Zaporozhye front around Robotina last year. So, they were put into an active defense role that we also talked about, where you would have the less experienced, the throwaway troops, probably Russian speakers, and then you'd have these guys partly as enforcers, but partly as better trained, better motivated, and better equipped troops that were there to plug the gaps. Now, there's 3 brigades in particular that are known for this, but no, they're not exclusive. It's not exclusively just them. So there's the 47th, which is the new brigade that was formed for the 2023 Ukrainian spring-summer offensive, or counteroffensive, if you like. There is the 67th Brigade, which is the right sector brigade. So, when you look at those videos of Ukrainian graves and you see the red and black flag, that's who they are. It's a simple dual color of black and red. And then you have the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, which is ostensibly the Azov Battalion, but grown larger and incorporated into the rest of the army. So the 47th had refused to stay any longer in Ochertina, but they were there for a rotation. And I think it was the 113th. I could be wrong. And what had happened was the 47th just refused to stay.
Here it is, and if I remember, I sent you that Asia Times articles, right?
Yeah.
So just the excerpt from that's getting at what you're talking about. It says there are already some reports that brigades in the Ukrainian armed forces refused orders from their commanders. Those include the 25th Airborne Assault, the 115th, the 67th Mechanized, and the 47th Mechanized.
Yeah, that's it. Right. Now the 67th is, as I said, it's the right sector brigade that also abandoned their duties in Chasiv Yar. Now, Chasiv Yar has really slowed down for the Russians. And, there was a video at the beginning of April that Weeb Union did, and he called it, one of the times that they got like over 2 kilometers or close to 2 kilometers worth of territory. He called it the most successful strike yet. And they had 6 armored vehicles that went in. No turtle tanks. We'll get to it. And they all survived. But there was a video that Weeb Union and History Legends, they're buddies, and they did a stream today as well. But History Legends, April 16th, did a video that showed at least 3 other assaults that the Russians did. They made gains, but they were quite costly. quite costly. I mentioned it in one of the shows, I think. But in any case, it's worth watching those guys because they, for one, our maps that we use, um, are from Weeb Union, because he's so reliable. Um, he also has contacts on both sides of the war, as does History Legends. So, and I just find that Weeb Union's maps, they're all doing it now, but he has the trench outlines. He was really the first to start doing that, and I just find that very helpful. So you can see basically what the goal is, right? Because as I said on the previous show, um, like taking Donetsk is a very important task. There is talk, including from some Ukrainian officers that published today in a Swiss magazine called Swilt, that said by October they expect that the Ukrainian forces are likely to collapse. And as I've said on this program several times, including last year, and even in late 2022, I think what the Russian strategy is not to repeat, um, on the surface of it, a operation to take over the key cities of Ukraine, especially with the force that's not large enough. But even with the large force, because that will eventually bog them down. And we saw that in 2022, that, while it kind of helped, it didn't help taking Donbass. And I do think that is a number one concern of theirs, or should be. And, a lot of the larger cities that they may want, that they might have expressed a desire for, and again, I think there's a bit of incredulity to that as well that has to be considered, because some of it is just geopolitical trolling, especially if it's coming from Medvedev or Peskov. Even though Peskov is obviously, they're both part of the Putin administration. Obviously, Peskov is a spokesman. What I'm trying to get at is something I said back in late 2022 and in 2023, and that is the Russians are looking for a kind of a collapse where some of the big cities, the important regions, fall to them like an apple out of a tree into your hand, that kind of thing, right? Um,
They don't want
or
a repeat of Mariupol over and over, where they have to lay siege to the city for two
yes,
months.
yes, that would be very difficult, and it would be very costly. I'm not saying they won't do it. I'm not saying they don't have some other plan, or like there's still this talk about 120,000 troops in this area, stretching from Sumy to Kharkov, and then even some places just north of Kupiansk on the Russian side of the border. I'm not saying that's never going to happen. Um, a push from there could cause enough of a panic that the Ukrainians begin to abandon certain positions in the Donbass. I think the Russians are content basically with the Zaporozhye front. Uh, I think the fortifications are important. The railroad is nearly complete. Yes, the Ukrainians are going to receive more missiles, but they're fixated, at least they say so, on the Crimean Bridge. Even the Lithuanian president or one of their ministers said, take a photo of it because it won't be there. Like all this tough talk from one of the Chihuahuas. So um, I just think that a city that was once 1.3 million people, right? Like, um, even if the Ukrainians have something like 50 to 60,000 soldiers holed up into the city, like that could that could take a long time. You know, it's a very very big place. I mean, it's bigger than Donetsk city. It's not a small task. You would have to surround the city to begin to cut it off, and from the western direction in Sumy, that could leave you isolated. Anyhow, before I keep diverting myself, um, let's go to some of the next slides. So let's return. What slide are we on at the moment?
So I just showed the new one. We showed the topographic map. So we're on the third one,
Okay.
and that is the outline of. Let me see. That's towards Novo Bakhmutova.
Yes. Yeah. So this area, you can see how much it's expanded. This represents about 20 square kilometers. I don't have an update from today, so this is from everything that happened up until yesterday morning, afternoon at the latest. Uh, you can go to the fourth slide, which is kind of where things were last week, and you can see how much this zone of control has expanded for the Russians. This is from Syriac Maps. This may even have been like the day after we did the show, because I can see it's an expansion of the foothold that they created. And then we can go to slide number 5. Slide number 5 gives you an idea of the gains south of Avdiivka. So you on this slide you won't see the gains there. You'll see the gains the Russians have accomplished basically in the last week or two. And the most important one is Krasnogorovka, and we will zoom in on that. So that's the next slide, which I believe is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Slide number 6. Again, this slide is from yesterday. The Russians have expanded a little bit in the central area, but if you look also to the right of the frame, that was a huge chunk of territory that they gained. So the use of fab bombs is and the use of the turtle tank, which I'll show you, have been instrumental. Let's just skip the next slide and go to the topographical map so people understand kind of maybe where some advantage the Russians have. So this is a topographical map of Krasnogorovka, and you can see that the Ukrainians are not in a favorable position. There is a waterway. That blue area that you see, there is a small river that goes through there. And the Russians basically took over the most advantageous areas. And this is after they were pushed out. 2 days later, they came back in, and they've really solidified their gains there. And I'm just going to skip the next few slides. Why don't you go down to the turtle tank, the vertical picture that I have.
Oh, actually, I lined this up where I think I can get all three of them in one shot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, let me. Okay, that's the. Yeah, let me try to. Okay, yeah, I have the two on there at least, the ones that really get the gist of it.
Yeah, so you can see now there are 3 of these tanks now, and you know they've been famous now for like going into the gray zone in Krasnogorovka last week, and just being almost like invulnerable. Now one of them did get damaged, and it was eventually retrieved by other armored assault units. Um, History Legends did also a very good video the day a few days after April 16th. It might have been on the 20th. About this assault brigade and how it went. I touched on it as well. I mentioned that Dima from military, what is it?
Military summary.
Military summary. I always want to say military analysis, but it's military summary. And he mentioned like another group of vehicles that came out. You know, 6 went in, they split, and then they went out again. Four returned, two were damaged. But then there was another round of vehicles that came back, and it was actually Dima was right. There were some more vehicles, but in interest of his video, he didn't really show how that. He didn't show the full video that explained that. Um, for me, it just looked like three new vehicles. Anyways, it was a group that was split with originally 12 that split into 3 and 9. Um, you can put those slides up. They're near the bottom above my turtle tank pictures.
Yeah, I have them.
Oh, okay. So, um, yeah, this is Krasnogorovka is very well defended. It's not like taking over Ochertina. Um, it's not a village. It's a proper town. It has like a small industrial section. It has dakias like all of them do, and residences. But you can see, as I said earlier, with the topographical map, the Ukrainians are not in a favorable position. Um, and then maybe the last bit of news is we can move to the north. And if you put up the first slide beneath the Krasnogorovka topographical map, there's a very, very small gain, obviously, and it is from yesterday. Um, this is in the north towards Kupiansk. And then you can follow with the close-ups.
Okay.
So the Russians have tried unsuccessfully last year to take over this area. And Kislovka is the town that they've taken over. Now they've expanded control in this area. Basically, about 90% of this village is theirs now. And they've begun attacking the town Kotlyarovka. Kotlyarovka is the little village right next to it. Um, Again, this is an area that it's not that well fortified. There are dugouts there, but not that many, as you can see in the blow up. But um, it does lead with certain roads that connect it to Kupiansk and the Oskal River, so it is important that way. Um, while there have been several bridges that have been destroyed in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye area, and of course in Donetsk, I haven't seen a bridge destroyed in the Kupiansk front for quite some time. So that might be something that we're going to see inevitably. Um, but that's about it for the frontline news. The big feature story is the taking of Ochretino, and then Novobakhmutivka, and the other one, Soleyova. It's just next to it, north of Berdichi. So these are small villages. Ochretino is like a big village in comparison with a railroad station and everything. So this expansion of control it's shown several things, and the Western press acknowledges that morale is very low right now with the Ukrainians, and all of them admit to heavier attritions of their units. It has not become easier for them to basically gang press men off the streets into the front ranks, into the trenches. They have started now a program that has something like over 10,000 recruitment officers that are scouring through Kiev.
And mind you that they had to purge the recruitment officers because they were some of the most corrupt public officials in
Yeah,
Ukraine, and anyone who could afford to buy their way out of it practically could. Anyone who could afford to get to Moldova, they were able to, and that's how weak the security was on that. And one of Zelensky's key moves about, I would say actually towards the beginning of the year, probably January, February, if I'm recalling correctly, was just a complete cleaning of house of recruitment officers, and you've gotten yourself into a strange situation where
yeah,
so the beginning of the war, the most hardliners were the ones who took the combat casualties. That on top of the Russian-speaking conscripts. That's no surprise. But at this point, a lot of the hardliners, the people most dedicated to the Ukrainian national project, are the ones who are enforcing the front lines, the ones who are responsible for dealing with deserters, and the ones responsible for gang pressing the men into service, because these are the only people who will not be bribed out of it. And even then, that's questionable. A lot of people have very flexible morals when there's enough of a reward on the line. And
Hmm.
to add on top of all of this, we do have the Ukrainian move to deny consular services to military aid and abroad. And so far, both Poland and Lithuania said they are going to cooperate with the Ukrainian government in that regard. Now, those are the only ones who have outright said it. We'll see what other, particularly European nations, do with their Ukrainian diaspora population, but we could see a massive movement towards that. And as we have speculated previously on the show, we could see a lot of Polish, Lithuanian, etc. nationals going in as quote unquote Ukrainians in order to plug those gaps.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think one could say that the way 2024 has been going, and maybe you could also include the last month of 2023. The Russian army is performing, but also Putin has finally, hardened his heart. Everybody was thinking, like, when is he going to, you know, act with more resolve? And you can see now that, I've said in this show, you've said it, like, I don't know if the Russian public can handle a war that just goes on for 10 years. That's a long war. I know there are people who think like Russia is going to go all the way to Lvov. There's even some channels that I follow that I respect that they are convinced of it. I, I, I could be wrong. I just don't see it. And I think we're looking now at, we're looking at aerial supremacy that the Russians have now. Yesterday, another HIMARS was taken out. There was another, not non-HIMARS, but MLRS delivery system that was also taken out. The Russians are getting better and better at this, and even the Western press has acknowledged, Political, Forbes, Bloomberg have said that this is probably because the chips that they're getting from China are the more advanced chips, and their accuracy now is, really 1 to 2 meters, not like 7 to 10 meters. So they're far more devastating, and the fab bombs have been a boon for them because it's relatively old tech, and they have a lot of it, so they can retrofit all these old bombs that they've had for a long time. Also, there was an attack on, like, there's been several attacks in the Krasnodar region and the Vorozhin region of Russia. This is outside of former Ukraine. Oil refinery was hit. An air base was hit as well by drones, not by missiles. But there was also an incident where 5 Storm Shadow missiles this week were intercepted by the Russians, but they counted 15 had been launched, and there's a sort of a mystery about what happened to the other 10. Now, I might be wrong on that they're Storm Shadows or not. They could be another type of cruise missile. But one of the things that that an analyst I was reading said was some of these missiles are actually quite old, and their engines might not help them actually make it all the way across the Black Sea to their targets. So that's just something to consider. And that might be also a reason why, besides the numbers of these missiles going down, there is all this pressure on Germany to send in the Taurus missiles. All right. Germany is still adamantly opposed to it. And, they sent the Ukrainians 6 Patriot systems. Each one is $1 billion. And America has pressured them to send one more. Spain uh, was pressured into sending more. But Greece actually only sent in missiles, but no system at all. In fact, they have refused to send in any launch or radar units, but except for missiles. But it doesn't even matter whether it's an S-300 or not. They won't send them in. Some people have speculated that that means that they know that the war is over. Others have said no. It could go into a new phase where they feel that they might need them. And of course, what that's implying is NATO troops on the ground. Now, guys like Weeb Union are saying no. There isn't. They're just the numbers are not sufficient for the Americans to go in. I would also add that in an election year, if Biden sent troops into Ukraine, I mean, he's already very low, right? He's already lagging behind Trump and has been for at least a year. Um, his numbers will completely plummet.
Oh, absolutely. Unless
And
there
they don't
is
have, and it's not just like a personal rivalry. They don't trust what Trump will do. Like,
no, no, they don't, and I'll
yeah,
actually get into that in a second. But Biden would have to pull off such a masterstroke that is impossible. I would say it would be a 1 in a million chance, at least, just to pick a random figure, that would just completely implode Russian morale if there was some sort of great U.S. show of force. And frankly, America does not have that capability anymore militarily to even have that sort of show of force. And just given the circumstances, that's simply not going to happen. This isn't Iraq. This isn't even the Iranians. They there's nothing there. And you see this now, and we'll talk about this later, with Biden and Blinken trying to put all this pressure on China in order to decouple itself from Russia. And
it's
it's
ridiculous.
been pathetic, like I said. We'll talk about that later. But it's really a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation because he needs this show of force, he needs a show of strength, he needs to show that America is still serious about the Ukrainian war effort and can give it uh, reasonable support but also he can't get too aggressive, as you said, especially in an election year. And we'll get into the Repo Act. We'll get into more details about the aid bill, but this is really just band aids on a gunshot wound. Just to be
Yeah, yeah.
quite honest.
And there's also I think a financial and economic angle that you can look at right now. Okay, so we've been saying on this show, and you predicted in November 2021 that America would eventually destroy the Nord Stream pipeline. Um, if you look at, let's say, China, right? In '95, they pegged the renminbi to the American dollar. And this also explains why Milei winning in Argentina is so important because I don't know if the Argentinian peso was already pegged to the U.S. dollar, but essentially it doesn't even matter anymore because he's going to be using the US dollar, right? So the thing that Blinken, of course, is also afraid of is because, of course, China has two currencies, the renminbi and the yuan, right? And the yuan is not pegged to the US dollar. And so they have very different roles. The yuan is used for buying commodities and stuff. Well, no, I mean, the renminbi is used for buying like gas from Saudi Arabia, let's say, right? But there's also, ever since the spring of 2022, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, China, all these countries do a lot of their business for gas and oil that don't use the American dollar, right? And part of the reason for this war as well is that America is afraid of being left behind. That is, if there's a solid economic integration between Germany, Russia, and China, right? Remember, like it took ages for the Americans to convince the Europeans not to create any more deals with China, right? And so these wars for America are also a way of money flowing back into America. Now, of course, when the Americans go to China, they're threatening them. You better keep up the treasuries. They make the same speeches to the Japanese as well, right? But what they want to do is they want to stop like a hemorrhaging, because like every 100 days the US inflation goes up by $1 trillion, right? So by 2027, 2028, it's going to get really serious in America,
Yeah, it's
right?
something like 4 trillion a year in roughly in
Yes.
terms of debt accumulation, and that's still on top of. I think it's like a. I can't remember the exact figure, but the yearly budget deficit is something outrageous. It's up there like towards the um, almost towards the trillion mark. Like I said, I can't quote an exact figure on that, but there's been no effect, no attempts to curtail spending anywhere or cut back on any sort of budget expenses. It has just been spend, spend, spend. We can inflate our way out of a depression, which has been the mode of going for several years now, especially since 2020, especially since the economic strain that resulted in. And this has just been the strategy going forward. You even have Trump talking about fighting back against de-dollarization, which, I mean, fair enough. In principle, you want to fight for the strength of your currency, but given the global dynamics and given what is happening right now, it would be one of the most belligerent moves that the Americans could make, trying to reassert dollar supremacy at this time, and really that there's no contingency plan. They didn't ever expect a future where the dollar might not be hegemonic,
Yeah.
which is the real threat here. And now they are scrambling to try to preserve this very quickly slipping hegemony, at least in terms of economics, at least in terms of the dollar. And frankly, it doesn't look like they had a backup plan. It doesn't look like they have a contingency plan. And as you said, that's why you have the desperate attempts for reshoring of industry or trying to move it into, let's say, more amicable countries like Indonesia versus China. And it was India there for a few years, but India has been waffling back and forth. India has really been playing both sides of this
Mm.
this global, let's just say, feud, as it were, this second Cold War. But it's a dire situation, and it doesn't seem like anyone would have thought, what if in 20 years something like this happens? Because you'll recall, now, there were a myriad of factors, but one of the main factors for our overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Gaddafi in Libya was their threatening or their attempts to trade oil outside of the US dollar, whether that been with gold, whether that been with the
Yeah.
euro. Now you have Saudi Arabia openly trading oil outside the US dollar, and we have not even touched them. Uh, and
Right.
and
If you
there's other
go ahead.
nations with a lot more firepower and economic power, like China, Russia, etc., that are trading outside of the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. is powerless to effect change on them. And the less you use the U.S. dollar, the harder it is to sanction these countries. And then you combine that with the Repo Act, which we've given the president unilateral authority to seize and freeze Russian assets however he sees fit. And you think that's not going to apply to China? You think that's not going to apply to Saudi Arabia or any
Yeah.
of these
Yeah.
other nations? Like I said, you've just, optically speaking, you can be the most hardline neoconservative in the world. You have just destroyed global confidence in the American economy because you've given the president the authority that you would typically associate with some third world dictator just arbitrarily nationalizing industry before he gets overthrown in some CIA-backed coup. And like I said, you've given this to what is, at least at one point, and maybe arguably still is the most powerful man in the world, in order to start freezing assets, all the money that's tied up in America. If I were Japan or Germany, which I know quote unquote allies, but we all know it's a very much patron client relationship, I would be sweating if I were the Japanese or the Germans at this point.
Right. And just to, because that ties in very well with what I'm getting at. Like if you take the debt now is what, 34 trillion?
Yeah, 34 trillion.
It's 34 trillion, right? So that's going to grow probably to like what, 37, 38 by the end of the year.
Uh, yeah, that sounds like it would be on track if.
So by 2028, you're looking at over $45 trillion. When it hits $50 trillion, right? Just to pay off the principal on the debt, right? Uh, at that point, the American dollar becomes almost worthless for a lot of people. Now, if the American dollar was still the only game in town, it can survive, but it's not the only game in town, and it won't be the only game in town forever and ever. So the wars in a way sustain the dollar because, well, for one, they've ruined the euro, right? And I know I've said it on the show many times. There was a time when, of course, the euro had much higher purchasing power.
And you even look at 2008. We can go back to 2008, because you had at that point the European Union combined all European Union states, and they hadn't even done some of their expansions yet. Actually, had just a slight edge on Americans in terms of GDP. The euro had a favorable exchange rate to the dollar. It still technically does, but how far the euro gets you in Europe these days, just speaking from personal experience. Now,
Right, because of
yeah,
inflation.
yeah, I mean, I'm not good because I've gone to some of the just poorer parts of Europe, but that's aside the point. But with that, it, you could argue that 2008 was possibly an inside demolition operation to stop the Europeans from getting one over on the U.S., much like the Ukraine
Mm.
war. And like I said, I would actually love to do a special on that when we do a deep dive, actually try to explore. Because I'm not sold on that question one way or another, but I'm open to the possibility of it, especially with how blatant U.S. policy has been since then, especially considering the fact that you had George W. Bush advocating for NATO expansion. You had him involved with wanting to add Georgia and Ukraine to NATO. The idea that he would tank the European economy with '08 at the expense of some of the U.S. economy, I think that completely tracks. But like I said, I want to explore that on a different day because I think that that's actually a pretty interesting topic. But just as primary as this goal uh, in the Ukraine war of toppling Russia and making Russia look weak has been the further subjugation of the Europeans, both on terms of just a grand civilizational level, in terms of narrative, in terms of the flow of history and what story you want to tell, what ideas you want to enforce, as well as pragmatic concerns. Because ever since 1945, and you could argue going back to 1918, 1919, World War One, the establishment of the League of Nations, and the other just attempts at a proto global liberalism, I suppose you could say, just for lack of a better term. It has been just this American triumphalism, this Americanism, the idea that liberal ideas are the only ideas that have to be spread globally. Well, if you have a strong Europe, I mean, Europe, of course, has adopted many liberal principles, but they're not as innate as they are, at least in the current American system. It's not
Yeah.
it's not part of like that foundational mythology. So it's just something they just have to adopt. So there's that. If you have a strong old world, and I would say that even applies to China, regardless of what you think of China or questions about the Cultural Revolution, what communism has done to their culture. But point being, it is a very much a new world versus old world struggle. They need those new world ideals, the new world way of doing things. They need that to be triumphalist. This is what won the 20th century. This is what's going to win the 21st century. But then you also look at the more pragmatic concerns is uh, an economic, not even union, a strong economic relationship between the European states and Russia. And I'm thinking particularly, uh, let's just say the big three European states, excluding the UK, Germany, France, Italy, the real power players within the European Union. If they, not even good diplomatic relations, but if they're on good business relations with the Russians, that is a powerful block because you have them, particularly the French, well, actually, particularly the Germans, to a lesser degree, the French and Italians, are able to make these precise, very high tech items. That this very precise industry combined with cheap Russian energy, it is once again, it's a natural alliance, one would think.
Yeah.
And that is why there's been so much work since the end of the Cold War to drive that rift between it to crumble the Russians. And now the Atlanticists, while they did have some pushback, while there were pragmatists and even business interests, I mean, Merkel really had to balance that tightrope between Atlanticism and business interests. That's why Nord Stream got built in the first place. But now
That's
you,
right.
it's
Merkel understood, and when we talked about it after the Nord Stream pipeline, and then all her attestations about Russia that seemed to contradict everything that she did during the end of her chancellorship. Uh, Everything Merkel did points to her fundamentally understanding what was happening to the American dollar, where economic centers were shifting to, and what role she thought she could play for Germany and secondarily for Europe. And I would say that the British leaving the EU, therefore never adopting the euro, was their way to kind of hedge, like to survive basically against what will happen to the EU. I don't know how good this is going to be for the sterling, but in any case, I do think that was like a might have been a factor in why they why that was effective or why there was a push for it, even though a lot of the globalist elites that we know, you know, were not in favor of Britain leaving the EU. So I don't know. That's always something I think about from time to
I
time.
mean, I would
Was
say with that and the EU and the British were arguably the most. Now, I know this is rich saying after 2022, after the Europeans have shown themselves completely incapable of resistance to Atlanticist diktats, because I mean, I'm not even saying it's lack of willpower on the part of the Europeans. I'm okay. I'm not necessarily saying that because I do think that is part of it. But the system is just so ingrained that there's no real avenue of resistance against just unfettered American interests in Europe. And I do think that with the UK in the European Union, they were probably the strongest representation of that.
Mhm.
And them breaking with that did somewhat open the door of opportunity to have a more, let's just say, strategically autonomous Europe, to borrow Macron's terms. Now, Macron, biggest snake in the European Union. We're going to have lay sovereign European Union while also submitting to every whim of Atlanticism. It, like I said, just the representation of the American Empire's interest behind a coat of European sovereignty, playing on uh, very superficial anti-Americanism. I'll just put it that way. That's in terms of Macron. I don't think you can.
Yeah.
I think that's the real take on him. About what 5 6 years. No, no, we're on to like 7, almost 8 years of him being in office.
It's incredible.
How the time flies by. But
Yeah, I mean the see Croatia adopted the euro, right?
and you notice
Has Poland
Milanovic
adopted it
shut up
yet?
real quick after that. But Poland, no. Poland is still on the
The
whatever.
zlote.
Yeah,
Um, I wonder if there's like a mechanism, that was pushing on Britain to eventually adopt the euro as well, because I know that was a sticking point and always has been between them and the European Union. Is they always wanted this the independence of their denomination, right? So I just wonder, was there a mechanism? Was this one branch of the elite arguing with another? In any case, the whole point of it is that now the euro is weak, which gives short and medium term life to the American dollar. And if they had, like, if America had a war in, like, there's basically three theaters where America could do a war. Before I describe the nature of the war, the three regions are, of course, Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East. Now, the nature of the war should be as such that a good cash flow comes into America as the result of the war, right? They're buying American military tech. The line between, are you with the China, Iran, Russia side, or are you with us, becomes delineated ever more resolutely. Um, so you don't want like a super hot war. You want another proxy war, and you want that kind of inflow for the American dollar to remain.
and I will actually return to something I was saying back in December. While I don't think it's likely, I think in terms of that kind of war that you want, uh, an outbreak of war in Korea would actually be more suitable to those goals than, say, China versus Taiwan outright. Because sieging an island, just the nature of that kind of war, is not going to lend to the kind of slog that at least they created in Ukraine initially. And the Korean Peninsula, I'm not saying that something's going to happen, but in terms of if we're to assume those are America's interests, which I think is a reasonable assumption, something like Korea would be a much more suitable terrain, both figuratively and literally, for a conflict like that.
Yeah. It's hard to. I mean, yes. I've watched some analysts basically saying that a war in the Korean Peninsula could actually be better for the Chinese than Taiwan, as you said. And wherever it will be, and the Americans may not risk one in Korea, but somewhere in East Asia, for instance, or maybe another front opened in Europe or the Middle East, but something that
Why not combine the three and have it in the Caucasus?
so they need this kind of a mechanism to kick into place, right? Uh, I mean, they gained some industry of the Europeans, primarily the Germans, but a lot of most of German industry actually moved to China. Um, but that isn't to say that they haven't. And just the severity of the situation, right? And I remember when the war first broke out, I remember doing one of the podcasts and saying that it wasn't until late February that the Swiss closed seized the assets of the Nazis, and it was at the end of April essentially that that the Germans lost the war, right?
Yeah, they seized it about 2.5 months before outright German surrender.
Yeah, yeah. Um, just think, because the war had been raging since 1939, right?
And
Now,
even if you want to go
Swiss,
back to the small skirmishes and the annexations before the war, we're talking 1936.
right, right. Now, if you just look at the war now, you have Switzerland seizing Russian funds. Well, it's not huge; it's like 5 billion, but they did. Um, the Russians have seized 440 million of J.P. Morgan's assets. Uh, there is going to be retaliation, and I think in some ways that the Americans want this. For them, this is kind of like building a new world order, building like a new status quo.
Oh, of course. Now, I am curious. I don't know if you have any more insight in this. I know a lot of Russian money was tied up in Cyprus, and Cyprus, of course, part of the European Union, so they are obligated to follow the current sanctions regime. But do you know how liquid the funds are in Cyprus? Are those just completely frozen, or are there some backdoor channels they've had to access those funds?
I have no idea.
And not just you, but just the audience in general. If anyone knows more about that, I'd be curious to know because, like I said, I know especially a lot of like energy money was tied up in Cyprus.
Hmm.
But like I said, that's aside the point. And I actually do want to return to my point about just the dynamics of the Europeans, the Americans, and the Russians. And I suppose I can use this to segue into some of Blinken's comments about China. So Blinken goes to China. Now, mind you, American-Chinese relations have been at a complete impasse since the Alaska summit in 2021 when we sent the purple-haired negotiators to talk to the Chinese delegation. That actually happened. We covered that like August, September 21. If it was actually right after Afghanistan, I think. So we were already coming in from an embarrassment, and we send that. We have that embarrassing diplomatic negotiation in China, well, with the Chinese in Alaska on our home turf. So once again, just a series of black eyes in that regard. And there's been no progress between American Chinese relations since then. You have in 2022, they refused to really budge on the sanctions package. They say they're quote unquote staying neutral, which means they're still continuing full economic relations with Russia. Kissinger dies, so really the last American who was able to speak to the Chinese in their own terms is gone, and he doesn't really have any sort of equivalent or successor who can really fill that role. So then you have Blinken go over to China just this past week, and he proceeds to just really castigate them. Is the only way I can put it about their refusal to participate in the sanctions package against Russia. And perhaps it's desperation, perhaps it's just old habits dying hard. But Washington is still very much interested in, at least ostensibly, in this chimeric relationship, trying to keep the two incestuously interdependent with one another. And I do think that on top of just the pragmatic, the economic, and the geopolitical concerns, which are certainly there, that they're trying to leverage Chinese power without making them too powerful, what they've been trying to do since the 1970s, is that in many ways, especially under China post-revolution. Now I know has been some cultural shifts in that Xi Jinping has been exploring Chinese history in much a way you haven't seen since before the revolution, willing to actually embrace all aspects. Not entirely. Not I would say not to the same extent as the Russians do, but willing to actually do away with some of the uh, real staples of the Cultural Revolution. You could actually see that in the past few years. That more quote unquote traditional culture is rising again in China. Now, to what degree, like I said, that's debatable. But the ultimate point on top of all of that is even this post revolutionary China, they still prefer cooperation with that. They still prefer leverage with that over the real core of the old world, which is, like I said, that cooperation block between the Europeans and the Russians. That is, I think, something that terrifies them on an ideological level, just to the core. It's something that is completely unacceptable to them. Even putting aside all the pragmatic concerns, even putting aside the pragmatic benefits of having that sort of power block in the world, even what that would mean for America and some of the lessening of their responsibilities, that it chills them to a bone on an ideological level to the point where uh, they would still rather cooperate with the officially communist China over any sort of, I guess, like you could say, old world bloc. And you're seeing this lashing out because of that, because the Chinese clearly do not share the same sentiments in that regard. That they are a much more pragmatic and business oriented country. Love them or hate them, you can't really deny the fact that when China conducts diplomacy, when they conduct business, they look at raw interest. Now, I'm sure, of course, there's always civilizational and ideological considerations, but at the point China is right now in 2024, at the point it is just ideologically speaking and pragmatically speaking, they're far more interested in the very raw pragmatic business deals, whether you be a monarchy like Saudi Arabia, whether you be some African state, or even the so-called liberal Europe. They're willing to still trade and do business there. And that's something also that we've been hammering on, trying to decouple China and Europe, just trying to cut off that last non-American lifeline to the continent. But that would be an economic disaster. The Americans, I mean, yes, we are very economically integrated with the Europeans, but the amount of money that comes in Chinese investment, especially in Eastern European countries of all places, is vital. You look
Mhm.
at the trade relations between China and the former Eastern Bloc countries over the past 20, 30 years. It has been uh, probably up to the hundreds of billions of dollars in investment and trade between the two. We're talking about a behemoth. We're talking about an economic engine, something that simply can't just be sanctioned or iced out. Even assuming that was a good idea, which I don't think it is a good idea, love them or hate them, to try to ice out one of the world's major powers, which China inarguably is. The moment for that has long passed. The moment of sending Blinken over there to castigate the Chinese as if they were speaking to, say, Iraq or one of these other just small players, that's far gone. I mean, we don't even have the diplomatic leverage to do that to, say, Turkey at this point. They laugh in your face and they send the mayor of Ankara to meet with you as part of your receiving. It was actually as part of this diplomatic mission. When Blinken arrived, he was greeted by the deputy mayor of what was that? Zhaojing, the second largest city in China. It might be Zhaojing. I might have it confused with something else. But they claimed the mayor was busy. They claimed the foreign minister was busy. That Xi Jinping was busy. But like I said, they didn't even send anyone associated with the foreign ministry. Not even like a deputy foreign minister. Like I said, the deputy mayor of Zhaojing was who they sent as the head of the welcoming party. This is the state of negotiations. This is the level of regard that China has for the Biden administration in particular, but I would say it's probably grown even beyond that, just America in general. Now, they never did this to Pompeo. Relations between the U.S. and China under Trump were very strange. There was a begrudging, I would say there was a mutual begrudging respect between the two. Now, dynamics in, say, 2019, 2020 America are far different than dynamics in 2024 America, where even if Trump does get back in office and whoever he puts in the State Department, can he really expect that warm welcome in China, especially with how much the dynamics changed? Trump in 2024, even to assume he were to do some good things, even if we were to assume that there would still be some benefit to him being, which, like I said, I think the jury's still out. I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions with that. The idea that he could play this like he played his first term, no, the world has shifted drastically, and while he still would be able to play some of his games, I don't think he would still be able to command the kind of begrudging respect he did in China the first time. And like I said, especially with just how unceremonious American Chinese relations have been under the Biden administration, I don't think that's something that just goes away with the president. I think that is a fundamental shift in relations between two nations, just on an overall level.
Yeah, and of course, you remember when the last meeting, which involved Biden and Xi. Of course, Biden called him a dictator before before Xi had even left the country, and you could see that Blinken was incredibly disappointed that he did that. Right? Obviously, something has happened that it's beyond the point of no return because before Biden had even left China, he basically said that, if China doesn't cooperate, with our stated goals, of course, the preamble was that, oh, we're already working on fentanyl and, and so on and so on. But if Biden doesn't, sorry, but if Xi doesn't, stop cooperation with Russia, then we're going to sanction more entities in China. And he then exclaimed that over 100 have already been sanctioned, and that number will increase. So it's a kind of a threat. He couldn't wait to say these same words, maybe a few hours later or the next day in the U.S. He had to do it there, and that was very symbolic. Um, so they obviously this war for the Biden administration is very, very important. Maybe it's even more important than what we outlined here about, the economic and financial concerns of the U.S. regarding their dollar. So it could be more than that, but in any case, it could be other things. It could be that because representatives of Hamas have actually gone to China this week. That's new. That's a big sign, and for that to happen in the same week that Blinken was there, that is a very clear signal from the Chinese, and of course a British ship, um, four ships altogether, British and Israeli, were hit by Houthis. A British ship was hit directly, so that's still going on, right? The war in Gaza and Palestine is still going on. Um, the fight on the border with Lebanon, that's still happening. And then you have the BBC uh, publishing a story with satellite images that Israel's uh, air defense base near their nuclear base was actually hit. There were denials of this, right? But now there's like, you have average Israelis with their cell phones filming one of these missiles, which had intercepted. You see all the little pock marks, the holes that were created. That indicates that an interception had occurred at one point before this thing had fallen. But there are videos where they eschew being hit. So, anyways, you've got this picture developing, and one of the things we've been saying is that you're going to see the fault lines more and more clearly as time goes on. There are going to be It's going to be hard for many countries that honestly can't afford to choose either side, that they'll be forced to choose a side. And one of those fault lines is in the Caucasus, and that includes Armenia and Georgia.
And with the Caucasus, you actually did have Putin meeting both with Pashinyan and Aliyev. Separate meetings. He didn't have the two together. And he is trying to diffuse situations. And like I said, we'll get into the story about Georgia in a couple minutes here, because I find that wildly, now this has been an ongoing thing, but I find it wildly entertaining, the political dynamics that are on in Georgia right now. But you can see right now, with the dynamics going on in the Caucasus, particularly with Putin meeting with both Aliyev and Pashinyan, he is very much trying to diffuse a conflict there. Now, unfortunately, just for the Armenians, that does mean playing into Pashinyan's defeatism and Pashinyan's concessions because, like I said, there's no recourse left. That this is the man who ceded the territory. This is the man who makes concession after concession, and
And four new villages were seeded. This actually brought out the residences, the civilians of these villages, out in the streets. He was having a town hall meeting. Highways were blocked. Priests had come out and pledged support for the people. And eventually, in the evening, Pashinyan brought his troops, and apparently they've been cleared. I haven't seen anything new since. Um, but he's given his country away, and I, I don't, I can't believe it. I mean, I just think that the deal is he gets to be in the EU as long as he plays ball with the Azerbaijanis, and I mean, it could be a trick. Obviously, you wouldn't want to trust the Americans, but you know,
no, and Azerbaijan's both a sticking point for Turkey and Israel because Turkey, once again, is a country that we may talk a big game about, but because of the dynamics of the region, it's a country that we do need to make constant backdoor concessions to, and you see it all the time.
mhm.
And Azerbaijan is going to be one of them, and as well as Israel. And if you're to believe some of the claims about the recent Israeli strikes that took place last week, that they used military assets they had in Azerbaijan in order to conduct that strike as well. That was part of the operation. So Armenia has to cede to both of them if they want to be part of the West because Azerbaijan is, while outward relations between them and the United States might not be good, Azerbaijan is important to very key American assets, that being Turkey and Israel. And like I said, although we are a bit on the out and out with both Turkey and Israel at the moment, just speaking overall, it's one of the just dynamics where uh, the whoever's in charge of the American empire sees fit to cede them to that. Now, whether that's actually going to help or not, I think that does remain to be seen because both of them are argued, especially Israel, are becoming liabilities insofar as America is concerned. But especially with the question of Turkey, just how geographically significant it is, one of those countries that you have to treat with kid gloves, and you see this
Mhm.
from both sides. And even the attempt at a coup, we saw how poorly that went. So, uh, more aggressive methods do seem to be off the table with that. And you haven't even seen that much of an attempt at a color revolution as well. But just getting back to the question of Armenia, it's with the dynamics of Russia or even Iran at that point, they've been left with no recourse. That they accept the concessions. Of course, you can't do this on behalf of a foreign state that has outright said, "We don't want you to do this for us." And you saw that
Yeah,
with the withdrawal of the
it's
Russian
untenable.
security
How can
force.
you?
It is. And like I said, unfortunately, because of those dynamics, there's just really no winning for the Armenians because on top of diffusing the conflict, not only were they left with no recourse in the first place, but the Russians were to try to even be more assertive with this and not just accept the deal made between the Azeris and the Armenians. That would be uh, interference with foreign power. You'd never hear the end of it in the Western media. And that would also just be dedicating resources in just an environment where really, at least no state apparatus is on your side, and you're just left in the dark going up against two states that have already made an agreement. So like I said, the situation is just
Yeah,
there's
I mean, he's repeatedly said that he wants to take Armenia out of the CSTO. Um, like, and then he badmouths and says you can't trust you can't rely on the Russians. But he's already made deals with Azerbaijan to give up these villages. Like, rely on what? I mean, um, so he's completely screwed this country, and there are a lot of diaspora Armenians, who are in the West, and they'll let's just say they'll remind you of the Georgians who are paid by U.S. and European NGOs. These people will literally destroy at least the culture, if not the culture, the territory, or both of of their nation. uh, just to be part of some economic bloc that they see as the only way that they can economically improve their situation. And in many ways, they become like little, economic mercenaries or geopolitical mercenaries for the empire, just because that's a way of earning extra cash. Um, anyways,
Yeah, and with that, I mean, the Russians also have a very sizable Armenian diaspora, but in terms of their lobby, I don't think it's as strong. I know Lavrov is Armenian himself, but that doesn't seem to influence much of what he
so
does.
I know an Armenian from Russia.
Go on.
Okay, so he was a gymnastics coach, and I mean, if him and I have had great talks, and but he's actually much closer friends with a very, very close friend of mine, um, who's Romanian background, and uh, Armenians that come from Russia are very different than Armenians that are like in the West. They're far less liberal, right?
I know they're very successful in terms of just business as well,
Yeah, I don't want to
but
I don't want to because I have another Armenian friend whose family moved to Canada eventually, right? Um, no, I wouldn't say he's conservative, but his parents certainly were. I met them um, before they passed away, but I, I just think it's a very different attitude, um, and like the ones from Russia, sorry, the ones that either moved to Russia or are Armenian ethnicity, born in Russia, um, they tend to be less sympathetic to the West, right? And the ones that are more liberal, um, let's say, they don't trust Russia first and foremost, and they look to the West as a way of resurrecting their nation. And as we've seen in several examples, there with European countries, there are a lot of countries that will give up an awful lot just to be part of this bloc. So you have like Kosovo, for instance, majority Muslim, fake nation.
Albanian drug trafficking hub is legalizing gay marriage.
That's right. They're legalizing gay marriage, and of course, Iraq passed a law to ban gay marriage, and which infuriated the Americans. So,
Time for
like,
Iraq War 3. This is going to be the deciding
yeah,
round.
yeah. I mean, it's just it's a homo empire. I mean, it's pathetic.
Can you think
So
of a better fifth columnist?
I can't. So anyways, I guess what I'm getting at is the kind of slavish devotion to the regime is really quite something, right? Like these people really are just economic nodes. They're not like they feel something for their country, but it's only like their country as a vehicle to belong to a larger.
Superficially.
Yeah, yeah. Like I mean, where are they protesting in the streets? These villagers are there because they live there. They're going to lose everything. There was a church that was destroyed a week before these protests that the Azerbaijanis had promised not to destroy, that was built in 1854, in one of these villages that the Azerbaijanis had already taken over. So of course you can't trust them. These are cruel people. Like I mean, they've already destroyed various churches. Like I don't know. Like I'm just saying I don't hear anything from liberal Armenians about this,
No, no, they.
including a friend that I spoke with recently, who's Armenian. Like never, not once. I don't know.
Many are eager to just pass this off on the Russians, and it's. I don't know what they expect, and I think everything you said is a good point. That they'll embrace this sort of superficial nationalism in order to ingratiate themselves to the West, and that also plays on let's say, some more of the right wing and conservative populations where they'll buy into the nationalist line, but at the same time they're selling their own nations down the river. And
Yeah.
I suppose with this we can pivot to Georgia with this just
Hmm.
nightmare of a situation. Okay, nightmare, it makes it sound a little too heavy, but just this joke of a situation
Yeah.
with the foreign agent law. Now, mind you, they modeled this on FARA, the American Act for the American Registration Act. Foreign Agent Registration Act is FARA, an American law that more or less says if you're a foreign agent, you're legally required to disclose this. Otherwise, you're going to face severe financial and legal penalties. You'll recall that they actually forced RT to register under FARA.
Hmm.
Actually, even before the war started. That was, I think, right before the war started. But the Georgians said that they modeled their law on this, and that's because you've had a lot of American NGO activity in Georgia. Now, however, Georgia, despite their very sour relations with Russia, in terms of business interests, they are still vital partners in that. So there hasn't been that strong of an adherence to the sanctions regime as far as Georgia is concerned. The situation with Abkhazia and South Ossetia has more or less been decided in the status quo that these breakaway republics are going to be de facto independent and de facto aligned with Russia, and that you're going to have Russian troops there, and the Georgians are going to tolerate that. Like I said, they haven't made a move on those since 2008. Whereas you compare this to Ukraine, the Donbass has been nonstop fighting since 2014. Now, of varying degrees of intensity, but at no point did it ever just freeze over like we've seen since '08 with the situation with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And as a result of the law to target foreign agents, which, mind you, it didn't say American agents, didn't say Western agents, it said foreign agents, which means presumably quite a few Russian interests would also be affected by this because there are, on top of
Yeah. Yeah.
business interests, there are a lot of, let's just say, distant Russian diaspora. When they did the mobilization waves and the war broke out, a lot of Russians actually migrated to Georgia. I think there's,
Yes.
I think,
There was.
yeah, I think that there's about 500,000 in that migration wave. I don't know what the total amount of Russians in Georgia, or maybe 500,000 was the total amount of Russians in Georgia. But I mean, Georgia's a small nation, so 500,000 would be a significant amount.
Significant.
But like I said, even though they are far from sympathetic to the current Russian state, they are still there. They are still foreign nationals inside the country of Georgia. Um, but presumably, it would affect their operations. It would affect the operations of pro-regime Russians, Chinese, any Iranian interest there, certainly Israeli interests. But it has been targeted primarily towards American NGOs, and that's not out of a Georgian lack of desire to cooperate with the Americans. Like I said, this country has expressed its interest in joining NATO multiple times, but they don't want the strings attached. They think they can have the best of both worlds with this, where they can crack down on the NGOs, they can crack down on the, frankly, Soros types, and once again, all the Soros clones that exist out there, while still being able to pander to the American empire, to the American defense industry. Now, mind you, Georgia is one of the situations where, despite the fact that they've constantly expressed their desire to join Europe, to be aligned to the West, the Russians neutralized them to the point where how many Western arms shipments have you seen to Georgia? Compare that to Ukraine in 2014 when you had NATO there practically rebuilding the Ukrainian army from the ground up. How many NATO advisors of any significance do you see in Georgia? Like I said, the situation has been the country itself might have poor relations with Russia, but with two breakaway regions that constitute about 20% of the country's territory, and albeit a smaller amount of the country's population, but still a significant amount of the country's population, uh, a number of diaspora, even if they are not aligned with Russian government interests, on top of all the business interests, Georgia is effectively in the Russian sphere, despite what they say, and the fact that they might drive out one of the key vectors of American influence, even if it would curtail Russian influence there, that's not a price that the American empire is willing to pay. So they're going to, ironically enough, use the same NGOs to mobilize all the resources they have in order to prevent the anti-NGO law from going through, the anti-foreign agent law from going through. They're going to have protests that are openly backed by foreign agents. And once again, you can go to places like the National Endowment for Democracy. They outright say this. This isn't
They're
speculation.
proud of it.
This isn't conspiracism. This is their stated agenda that they say openly and proudly as a homosexual at a pride parade.
Yes, absolutely. Um, I mean, the Georgians are just being very practical. They're not. It's not because they have some kind of love for the Russians, right? I mean, there's some of them that get along. Definitely, you can find some great Georgian restaurants in Russia. But I found two really good ones in St. Petersburg and another one in Moscow. But the thing is, as you said, this law would affect Russian entities as well as any other foreign entity, right? What upsets the Americans and I guess to a lesser extent the Europeans is that it would have because they dominate this country through their NGOs. It would have a far more severe effect on them than on the Russians because the Russian influence is, I don't know, it's almost negligible. And the people will say, well, there's some counterfactual facts about that. But the thing is you have to understand is um, Russia, and not through their NGOs. Russia's influence isn't like that. It's first of all, it's a neighbor. It has 300 years of history that they share. Much of it not good. It has two breakaway republics. It doesn't need to have NGOs. They're both Orthodox countries. They're both Eastern Orthodox. And really, what Georgia is afraid of is another Ukraine. They don't want to be another Ukraine. They don't, when you see publications with articles about how many dead mercenaries, Americans and Georgians and Poles are right up there. Those are the three countries, and they don't want this segment of the population activated and making another attempt for the Ossetian part, for instance, like they did in 2008. So they know very well how they could be manipulated, and that's all that this is about. And those people protesting, their bread and butter comes from the NGOs that they're literally paid. Um, yes, some of it is organic, but um, the organization, the lectures, the way these NGOs are integrated into the educational system, into the governmental system, that you can't downplay that. And media, of course, absolutely, media plays a big role.
Yeah, it's and like I said, these are all things that would be targeted by the foreign registration law, and it would be negligible because, as you said, most of Russian interests are tied up in business, and that's a much tougher nut to crack, especially when you want to crack down on the NGOs. And I think that despite the color revolution, despite the war, despite everything, that Russians, the Russian ability to neutralize Georgia, like I said, they've accomplished it already. It's something that is a not even a question in their mind that Georgia is going to be a problem anytime in the near future. Because what what are they going to do? You had the first time when they went to war, the Russians were within miles of Tbilisi in 10 days. And that's what actually forced the peace agreement. And you didn't see a great amount of Western sanctions because of that. You didn't see arms shipments flowing into Georgia because of that. All of that was completely off the table. The West was completely blindsided by that. It was an embarrassment. It soured them to Russia because it showed the Russians were still a force to be reckoned with. And then you compound that with the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of the separatist movements in the Donbass, and it just becomes a massive embarrassment for the West. Like I know it's a bit of a tangent, but it just still becomes a massive embarrassment for the West, and that they have really no recourse here. And I do think that while Ukraine is certainly the prize, Ukraine is the country that they do want to flip. It does create some amount of ire that they did fail in Georgia, and that the pushes against the NGO law, on top of just the pragmatic concerns of losing influence there, is just to really try to, I guess you could say, redeem themselves in that regard, trying to really reinsert their foot into the door, trying to pry their way into Georgia.
Yeah.
I suppose there is that also that news about Belarus, about the the idea that Belarusian dissidents are going to try to seize some border towns with Poland in hopes of
Yes.
in hopes of sparking regime change. So this comes on top of Lukashenko's comments, him talking about Belarus being ready for war. But once again, Lukashenko is somebody you have to take with a massive grain of salt, just with how inflammatory his rhetoric can be. I don't necessarily want to call him an unserious figure, but he's very exaggerative. He's a very hyperbolic figure. And it's very entertaining. This is the man who hugged a nuke. I saw that headline going around just over the past few days again. But yeah, this is the kind of man we're talking about. And of course, there is a massive contingency of Russian forces in Georgia, concentrated primarily along the border with Ukraine. Now, of course, that is tying down Ukrainian manpower because they do need patrols in case another front were to open. That's not a risk that they want to take. In fact, some of the NATO deployments speculated that NATO forces would secure that border so they could free up the troops in order to go into the actual fire line and actually go into combat. On top of having a contingency there, if there were any outbreak with Poland or Lithuania or the Baltic states in general. And the new plan is Lukashenko has at least accused the Belarusian opposition, the ones who have been protesting him since about, what was it, 2020, around his election. And Belarus does have an election coming up in the next year. It's going to be summer 2025, I believe, which is like so
August, I think.
that was the impetus for the first wave of protests with that. So of course they're expecting them to try that again. But you've had the Poles say that they would be willing to support Belarusian opposition. You have the Belarusian opposition saying that we could start an armed revolt so long as we had the support of Poland in the West. And now you have Lukashenko saying that the opposition is going to seize border towns and they're going to pipe in Western support from Poland. And while there isn't concrete evidence of that happening anytime soon, the precedent certainly exists. And if you want to be gratuitous, you could say this precedent has existed for 400 years. We've seen this happen time and time again. That's just the history of this region. But speaking in a much more contemporary sense, after 2020 especially, the precedent exists for some sort of
Yeah.
LARP nationalist movement out of Western Belarus trying to establish their autonomous zone, their free state, in cooperation with the West and their proxies. And that could be the second front that they're looking to open. But I do think that is probably the most dangerous second front they could open,
Yeah. Because
compared to.
you could, what is it, the Siloviki line?
Yes.
It would be a pretext to that, right? Because now the Europeans, particularly the Baltic states, want to freeze Russian traffic, particularly boats that are arriving from Syria on the grounds. This is laughable after the Nord Stream destruction, on the grounds of environmental concerns, right? It's hopeless. So, like, environment, you literally caused the greatest ecological destruction of the North Sea in its history, and you're worried about boats coming. I mean, obviously, it's all pretense.
Yeah, I mean that's to be expected of these people, but the situation in Belarus, like I said, that's probably the most sensitive topic NATO could touch because if they do try to halt Russian shipments, if they do try to cut Russia off from Kaliningrad, I mean, we're talking direct NATO territory here. We're not even talking about the gray area like Moldova and Transnistria, where it doesn't even cross into Romania, so it doesn't matter. Although Moldova is still aligned with the West at this point, but we're talking about, like I said, a very sensitive situation where if if Poland wants to get involved, they can. They have their avenue of intervention. They can very easily, in my opinion, try to spark some sort of uprising in Belarus. Now, I think that the regime is too stable for that to happen, but they have means to change that, and I think it's a matter of the cost of implementing such means is why they have not done it, rather than the incapability of doing so. Because I do think that is one of the avenues that they still do have in order to uh, in order to escalate something like this. That there is still a lot of Western influences from the years of Lukashenko playing both sides embedded within Belarus. 2020 was something of a cleaning of house, but it certainly
Hmm.
didn't take care of everything. There's still, like I said, a number of latent Western interests in there, and we could see any of those threads start to unravel anytime in the near future. And like I said, if we look at summer of 2024, this upcoming year, let's say that the situation goes very well for Russia on the battlefield, that we see a number of successful offensives, that we see Ukrainian morale start to crack and the situation start to deteriorate with that. At that point, especially with uh, election coming up, the DNC is probably going to be a nightmare. It's probably going to be an optics disaster for Biden, especially with the situation in Gaza. If I mean, you already have these college campuses, these university campuses, where you have these entrenched encampments of pro-Palestine protesters. Now, how fervent they are to the issue, I don't think is really relevant. The fact that they're there is relevant. What do you think if the war in Gaza is still going on to the extent that it is, or even let's just say close to the extent that it is, by July or August of this year? Do you think the DNC is going to go off without a hitch? Absolutely not.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's going to be in. Of course, it's in Chicago. Where else would it be if the DNC is going to completely turn into a nightmare? But I very well could see this being a repeat of 1968 in that regard,
Yeah,
especially
I thought the first thing I thought of
yeah,
was Chicago
yeah,
1968.
yeah, the left can force this issue. The hardline left can force this issue if they want to drive Biden or the administration into some sort of cooperative position. Now, I doubt that they're going to replace him at the DNC last minute, say with Gavin Newsom or Kamala Harris or one. I don't think that that's not going to
Yeah,
happen at this point.
ship has sailed.
Yeah, but like I said, if they really want to pressure Biden from the left, of course, I'm not advocating anything illegal. I'm not advocating anything at all, but they could make the DNC in Chicago a living hell if they want to. They can make it a complete collapse in order. It could actually probably get violent in in some capacity.
Well, Jill Stein has been arrested.
Yeah,
She
yeah,
was,
I saw that.
yeah. I mean, Jill Stein and RFK are basic junior are siphoning off votes that would probably have gone to Biden. So they're playing this spoiler role. Um, and the war in Gaza is going to legitimize these two figures for a lot of the people in the center left that vote for Biden. So, you know, now I don't know if the Biden administration is going to essentially look at itself as a lame duck presidency, and they'll go for broke and say, well, if we lose the election, we lose the election, but we'll do something crazy in between then and now. But again, just to return to
We'll pass a bunch
Webb.
of Trump-proof legislation like the aid package in order to tie the hands of the next administration.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking of. Like tie their hands by putting them in a war or in a conflict, even if it's a proxy, a new proxy, or an escalation of one, like Ukraine, um, so that they can't get out of it, right? And there was that article 2 weeks ago, um, outlining how it might have been the New York Times or the Washington Post that said how they're Trump proofing aid to Ukraine. So they're finding these measures that if
$100 billion package that's Trump proofed is what it said in particular.
Yeah.
So, like I said, they still want to continue this. Now, I believe that we actually talked about this last episode. They want to stabilize the Ukrainian government until at least the end of the election. Then,
Yeah.
if they're going to deal with the fallout of Ukraine losing, it's either something they can deal with on their terms, or a surprise they can put in the next administration. If Trump were to come into office, the Ukraine failure would fall on his shoulders.
Yeah.
Or if Biden were to pull off re-election, then they can manage it how they see fit. But it's just to keep Ukraine stabilized so it doesn't collapse in the middle of the election season, because that would, with everything they've staked on it, even Biden's most fervent supporters, I mean, they might not flip to Trump, but just stay home at that point. And
Yeah, I
with
think a
how,
lot of people are going to be disheartened.
yeah, I predict
E-
record low turnouts.
yes, even more so than when Hillary was running for president. Um, a lot of people are going to sit this out. So just to briefly return to the aid package, the 24 billion that's there to just replenish American stocks. I don't know if that's an honest reflection of the amount of drawdown, the amount that Biden gave more than promised to Ukraine last year. But it's indicative that they went overboard, and the majority of the funding for the bill is really just over 50% of it is just going to stay in the states. Only 14 billion in direct military aid to Ukraine. Just some of the packages, like there are um, no new that this could change, right? America did this last time where they were going to give 12 or 16 HIMARS units, but that number rose to like 30 something. Um, but the bill is vague, but it does not include new HIMARS units. It does nor Patriot systems. Now they allocated another 6 billion, but that's for weapons and weapon systems that will go online in Ukraine sometime in 2025. So those are far off, and so so basically, this is only enough money to pay for the Ukrainian healthcare system, the politicians, 10% for the big guy, uh, the army, you know. So I don't think there's been some bluster from time to time from the Ukrainians and even from some hotheads in the West claiming that Ukraine can still go on the offensive in late 2024. I would not doubt that the Ukrainians will make a play, probably somewhere in Kherson again, because they've re-entrenched themselves in Krinky. They also killed two civilians on Palm Sunday with just indiscriminate shelling. But I would not doubt that the Ukrainians will go for some kind of offensive somewhere just before the election. That could be like a small October surprise, just to give people the illusion that things on the front lines aren't as bad as they might seem.
Oh, of
Uh,
course. And
Even though most of the Western press, most of it, built the Swiss paper I mentioned earlier. Politico has had a ton of articles lately on this. Of course, Washington Post, the London Times, the New York Times. All of these papers are again and again restating about the dire situation in Ukraine with and really just days after the aid package was passed, that one, the aid package isn't that great, and of course we said so because like it's half of what the first aid package was, and most of it will still not go to the Ukrainians. But they the Ukrainians will get desperate and they will want Biden to win. So they are going to, I think, go for some kind of a counteroffensive somewhere, or maybe another terrorist attack in Russia. They'll try something in order to boost the morale. Um, unless Biden doesn't care and just goes for broke, I don't see the Americans intervening. I don't even know like what the Europeans could even muster because their armies are quite depleted, and the Russians don't care. Apparently there was two concentrations that were hit. Now I can't confirm this, but seven Czech officers might have been killed, and in Nikolaev another hit on mercenaries. So, but there are reports, and particularly in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye, people are seeing French soldiers with the French flag. That's been going around. I have not seen it yet. I've seen people talk about it. I've yet to see a photo or a video, but assuredly they are there. But you know, I can only see them playing a role to release units that are in the north facing Belarus and Western Russia to gain some kind of extra men on the battlefield in Donbass. Um, I'm just gonna, if it's okay with you, I'm just gonna send you some basically um, how Weeb Union sees this playing out. So I'm
Okay.
going to send you this map and what he's predicting about a summer offensive or rather not summer offensive but spring offensive. He's certain that if it doesn't happen right after Easter or a little bit before Easter, so that we're just days away, we're talking about Orthodox Easter, which is May the 5th, and Good Friday for us is May 3rd. So, or shortly thereafter, right? So he sees a three-prong attack, one going to Sumy, another one going to Kharkiv, and the other one going towards the Kupiansk direction. Um, on the other hand, you have um, history legend who thinks a third option of just bypassing Kharkov and then trying to surround the units, regain Izium, which the Russians had lost in September 2022. And the you would want them to be up until the Oskol River, which is not far from where those arrowheads are, and that would endanger supply routes that go to the Donbass region, and have hubs in Kharkov and Poltava and Dnieper. So, I mean, this would be a major attack. Of course, we don't know because at the moment, those Russian troops just doing nothing are tying up tens of thousands of reserves. And those reserves are sent in only piecemeal. And this is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians are losing territory. Is it's not just that they're running out of reserves, but that the reserves have to be rushed from these areas. And a lot of their crack units, as we explained earlier in the show, are already depleted. They've been heavily attrition in various fronts ever since the Zaporozhye front last summer. So um, maybe the Russians are themselves concluding that some amount of European forces will go in. Maybe they're just there because they think Belarus has to know that we will not tolerate a section of Belarus being cordoned off by so-called Belarusian nationalists, who many have already been fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Kiev.
Yes, and with that, I suppose we can get into this proposal for a Dnieper ceasefire, which I think is
Oh,
uh, I'll just say it outright. I'll discuss it further. I think the prospect in both terms of likelihood and outcome is ridiculous, but it's something that's being floated around. The idea of retreat to the Dnieper and building on defensible positions there. Mind you, this is a vein that cuts right through the middle of the Ukraine. It often is considered that cultural dividing line between Ukrainian Ukraine and Russian Ukraine, as it were.
Hmm.
And mind you, this slices several cities in half, not to mention Kiev itself in half. And some of the ideas of, let's just say, the more cautious voices in the West think that the Ukrainians should cut their losses, pull back to the Dnieper, cede everything east of it, and build an impenetrable wall to stop the Russians from coming in. And number one, I don't think that's going to happen. The idea that they're going to cede that much productivity. When we're talking about the economic engine of Ukraine, I mean, look, some, something around 20%, one fifth of territory in Ukraine is occupied by Russia, and those numbers continue to increase. And we're talking about industry heavy regions like the Donbass on top of that, strategic ports, Crimea, the Azov Sea. So we're talking these very strong economic areas. Now, I know in terms of mineral production and mining, while there is a lot of that in Donbass and in the east, that still does have a sizable. It still is a sizable industry in Galicia in the western part of Ukraine. But like I said, when it comes to the economic engine of Ukraine, it is that area in the east that is either under Russian control or in the gray zone. Now it does extend a little bit further west than that, but that's what you need to consider when we're talking about Ukrainian economic productivity. Now Ukraine is already a state that is completely dependent on Western resources and finances, but this would just solidify the deal. If you cut this off, you cut off their major cities, these hub of economic activities, and what do you have a series of East Berlin, West Berlin, just all the way down to the Dnieper River? I just don't think it's feasible. It's not feasible. And is it because they think they can build this impenetrable defense against the Russians so long as they have the advantage of the river? I mean, river crossing is possible. It might be costly, but it's certainly possible. You have dwindling manpower and resource. That's not going to work. And I believe I was actually listening to something from the Duran that pointed out just a very obvious point that should have crossed my mind, but it didn't immediately. That the Russians have troops in Belarus on the west of the Dnieper already. They're already there. If they really wanted to just have an all-out offensive, if they really wanted to just press the issue, they could go in from Belarus. Now there are yes a number of considerations of why they wouldn't, but like I said, if we were to assume that was the goal, if we were to assume that the Russians are going for a maximalist campaign here, then they would press the issue and they would just press in from Belarus. That's what they would have done from day one. Now I know there were some invasion positions that did come from Belarus, especially to put pressure on Kiev, but like I said, at the end of the day, it's something that if they're willing to commit their manpower, resources, and political capital, it's very well within their capability. But it just doesn't make sense from either side. The idea that this is going to be the quote unquote ceasefire line.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of uncertainties right now. Of course, it's going to, get desperate. Um, I would tell people like expect, for instance, uh, there's going to be like the Ukrainians are going to get some manpads. They are going to get some air defense systems. So we are going to see some Russian jets get shot down. Um, the when you see pictures of fighting in Chasov Yar and Krasnogorovka, and you see like helicopters literally just floating above the cities and shooting down, and Su-25s just in three pairs just flying over, bombing constantly. There's just nothing holding them back.
No,
If
the
there's
lack
an
of air
air,
defense has
yeah.
been a complete embarrassment for the Ukrainians. And you actually even look at the aid package here. I was curious this weekend, so I went back and listened to J.D. Vance's remarks on the Ukraine bill, which they're pretty insightful, regardless of whether you like or don't like the man. That it would increase production of I can't remember the particular, but it's the missile we use for the Patriot from 550 a year to 650 a year.
Mm.
Now this is like, and this is for all of our Patriot systems, the ones we keep for ourselves, the ones we send to the Europeans, the Israelis, the Taiwanese, which, mind you, Israel and Taiwan are also included in this. But it, the numbers, I think he said that it would have to be like at least 1,300 a year in order to meet the needs of everyone who are making these demands. It's like I said, it's unfeasible. Now I'm sure they have other methods, they have other ways that they can get air defense to Ukrainians, but it's it's an embarrassment. This is a country that can't function, and the Russians have taken great advantage of this, where they have forced the Ukrainians to pick and choose where they're going to put their air defenses. They'll strike at industry, they'll strike at infrastructure, and of course, you can't just let the Russians hit those. You need to deploy air defense against that. But at the same time, that leaves their front line completely undefended. That these men are subject to uh, airstrikes with more or less impunity, and it's not comparable. The Russians have ample air defenses now. Perfect, of course, not. Nothing is, but it is not only a strategic and tactical disaster, but it's just simply embarrassing. The fact that the
Mhm.
Ukrainians look like the Mujahideen out there without any sort of air defenses. I mean, not even like the Stinger. Like, and I know that they made a big deal about those at the beginning of the war, but like I said, not even that. And like the Russians have been operating with complete impunity. And if they want to prolong this war to November, which, like I said, I think that's the very least they want to do, the Ukrainians are going to need air defenses. I know that they keep on talking about they're going to get the F-16s to Ukraine. They're going to get the F-16s to Ukraine this year. And with that, you have these Western pilots coming over who are going to quote unquote train them. Uh, of course, we know that means they're going to end up flying them on behalf of the Ukrainians in a very deniable way. But I mean, even with the F-16, it's a good airframe. Don't get me wrong; it's something that it was the staple of the American air fleet for a number of years. But compared to the aircraft the Russians have put out, especially the newer ones, it's becoming obsolete. And you could argue because of just the troubles with the F-35 that yeah, you might want to fly an F-16 over an F-35. But I mean, hyperbole aside, we're still talking about a 50-year-old airframe. We're still talking about something that has been in service for 50 years. Now I know these things have a long lifespan of service, but compared to what we see, and compared to not only the Russian Air Force itself, but Russian air defenses, it while it would help, while it would make life more difficult for the Russians, it's wholly insufficient for Ukraine's goals. And there's no sign of negotiation anytime in the near future on Ukraine's part. Even if there were a desire from the Ukrainian state, no way their Western sponsors would let them pursue such course. That's just completely off the table. And I just can't see. Well, once again, I just can't see the possibility here them being able to rig up a solution time. They can do something to buy time, and really, I think it goes without saying. I don't think I'm particularly insightful for coming to this conclusion, but it just keep Ukraine solvent, both financially and militarily, until November, and then it can either be Trump's failure because he comes into office as it collapses, or it can be something we memory hole like Afghanistan.
Yeah, you know, and just to return to my point, because I agree with that point. I think we are talking about like an escalation that is going to, well, if not an escalation, let's say an intensification as election day nears and as more of the weapon systems come online. One of the things I've been noticing, and I'm going to send you some images now, is that the Russians have begun retrofitting their BMPs 1 and 2 with new active armor, but the BMP 3s, interestingly enough, are um, are getting an even more sophisticated system of protection. You're gonna see it in the images that I've sent you. let me. I know I had one here of. Anyways, you can see that to me, the way I read this is there's going to be an intensification of the war, and uh, the Russians understand that they are going to need uh, better protection for their vehicles because, as I said earlier, um, you know, a lot of these attacks are not successful, and there are losses. Um, Now, Russia turns out a lot of these vehicles, but you want to protect the lives as much as you can. You know, you lose the tank, all right, fine, but you know, you need um, you need the personnel who's trained to fight these things survive, right? Because it take months and months to train, but even just from a human point of view, you it's just not something you want. So I don't know. I read that as well. There were several videos. I'm sorry I couldn't find a better image of how the BMP3s are going to be. Hang on. How they what the final product is going to look like.
Still pales in comparison to the turtle tank, but I digress.
Nothing can touch the turtle tank. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't find it.
It really is just that we just keep progressing back to the early
Oh,
20th
I found
century.
it.
But yeah, I just can't get over the turtle tanks.
So you can see they're finally serious about protecting these vehicles, you know, because it takes years to come up with a new design and you know creating the machinery to craft them and so on. So and drones are just they're just death. I mean, the Russians have, you know, they've got on display in Moscow, and I'm sure they're going to parade them or feature them one way or another at the May 9 victory parade this year. They've got, you know, a Leopard 826 variant, one of the latest. The most latest is the seventh. But they captured an Abrams today that they towed, and it was the sixth Abrams that they've lost. And depending on which article you read, either is the Americans saying you're not using the Abrams anymore, or the Ukrainians have said we're not using the Abrams anymore. Not so much that like it's ineffective or it's a poor performer, but basically just the PR war is terrible. And remember, they only got 31 of these, and they've already lost six.
Well, I just have to say it was mighty
And for
anti-Semitic of the
years, they never even
Ukrainians in the
used them.
first place to use a tank called the Abrams when Israel is in such need. But as you were saying, on a serious note,
Yeah, so I just wanted to point that out. You know, and this
I mean, the prospects for Ukraine look, I mean, bleak is needless to say, but at this point, I know I've expressed great concern about a potential Western intervention, but even the prospects of that seem to be falling flat. And like I said, especially in an election year, especially with uh, Biden's legitimacy called into question on probably just about every other issue, and with how hamstrung the Europeans are, there's really no avenue for a greater Western intervention at this point than maintain status quo and hope the situation doesn't look as unfavorable in November. And hopefully you find some way to freeze it over. Hopefully the aid that is provided manages to boom them up. Now, I don't think it'll be nearly enough, but it's a point where they can neither escalate nor concede, which really puts them in a position where there's no other options at that point. If you can't concede, if you can't come to peace, if you can't come to terms with what's happening, but you also can't up the ante, there's nothing you can do, and it's just going to continue to be a latent embarrassment. It's going to continue to crawl along, and like I said, perhaps one of the better explanations for this is uh, that they've ceded that Biden's going to lose. They've accepted that yeah, Trump's probably going to get back into office, but at least we can stick him with this nightmare and make the political system even more ineffective for our enemies. And who knows? Who knows? That could be the plan. I'm not saying that necessarily, but that is one of the possibilities out there. And
Yeah,
I guess it does make sense in I know it's a bit of a stretch, but it does make sense. But I still don't see them. And with look, I know they're more threatened by what Trump represents rather than what he actually is, but I still don't see them landing themselves that big of a disaster just to get one over on Trump or even his supporters at that point. I don't know. They could be that petty. I could be wrong. But with how much they've invested in Ukraine, with how much of a sticking point that they have made, concerning the fact that they've staked the fortunes of the American empire on this entire Ukraine war, it, they need to escalate. I'm not saying I personally believe that, but the American empire, for the sake of its own legitimacy, needs to escalate, or like I said, that's just complete collapse in confidence.
yeah,
And like I said, I really can't put any other words to that. And I don't know if you have any last minute stories. I think we've covered everything we were looking at.
yeah. I think that's about it. The only thing I would add, I hate to keep returning to the subject, but one of the reasons why I think some attacks, like some of the counteroffensive, the all the West is saying Russia is going to do, and this is a very strategic area that the Russians controlled some of and lost back in 2022, and that is this, the forest belt. And this is the forest belt that essentially divides like Kharkov from Donbass, Lugansk. You can see how extensive it is, right? And it's an easy area to conceal yourself in. It's vast, right? Um, you would need some way to contain this area, and you can see it's a huge area. So I know a lot of people love big aero offensives, but this area really would not be any easier than going at a city that's like 1.3 million and well fortified. It's in some ways it could even be more difficult in some ways. But anyways, that's all I have.
Well, that is all I have as well, and we'll keep our eye on the situation. Now, the next week is probably just going to be pretty busy for us, so hopefully we can get something out sooner rather than later. Like I said, we'll have a proper celebration for episode 300 to actually put out there. Like I said, just because of scheduling circumstances, there was too much news not to cover. So I hope that everyone enjoyed the 300th episode of the War Report, and we'll be back with more new and exciting things in the near future. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.